the ability of people to make a living off the land in the rural environment is diminished. And that kind of living was a high calorie expenditure living. I mean, peasants in Punjab, which is where I'm from, working the land, burned a lot of calories, and their habits of how they eat in that environment, when translated to a suburb of London or Toronto, sitting in a car and watching television, those habits and that caloric intake do not really do them any service. And I think that's a big part of how I look at, some of these trends globally. So walking is less, a lot more, driving or even commuting in a bus, but certainly less energy expenditure is a big factor.
Okay.
If you then continue on and ask, and what about the trends in what we eat anyway? Clearly there has been a drift everywhere towards less home-cooked meals, more eating out, more fast food, more eating on the run. We have a heritage, genetically or evolutionarily, that makes us want and enjoy salt, because salt actually was a rarity before civilization and agriculture. Makes us like sweets. We didn't really have access to densely sweet things. The sweetest things we found typically when we were hunter-gatherers were a stand of fruit, and that lasted for a few days. We didn't gorge on it day after day after day. So what you have now is really, in a sense, a perfect storm of increased calories, particularly empty calories, reduced activity levels. And on that basis, across all segments of society, if you then layer on the other elements, including some of what you've alluded to,
Okay.
I think you have very alarming rates of obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, and heart disease. And the most alarming thing is many of these trends are recent, as you point out,
Right.
and therefore the full effects are still 10, 20, 30 years down the road. But a lot of people are quite concerned that after a century of declining mortality and increasing longevity in the United States, for instance, we may be reaching a stage where we don't quite see that. And in the next 20 to 30 years, we may see a slight drop in longevity if we don't get our act together.
But do you think that especially the government, especially big business, is to blame, where they package different foods? For example, you mentioned how many foods have high fructose corn syrup. Do you think that has something to do with it? That it's advertised in such a way to look appealing, but it really isn't very good for you. But they don't really kind of let you. It's kind of hard for, I think. Do you think Americans or even others are very good at kind of knowing what is nutritious and what they should be eating?
What you asked is an interesting question. And I was starting to get to it a little bit. Our heritage, our evolutionary heritage, makes us like salty things, I think. Makes us like sweet things. Historically, they weren't that available. But if you ask the question of the role of business and products, business produced products, I think it's not so much that there is a particular desire to see any particular outcome for health. I think it is more an economic desire to have a product that people will eat and like and want to eat again. You can't just stop with one, right? The great slogan.
Right.
And I think that the things that drive that kind of product design are things that are probably embedded in all of us. That said, there are certain, there's a famous slogan, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. That said, there are certainly elements of what the food industry has done that bear scrutiny. And I think the most egregious example, of course, is trans fats. and trans fats are probably as atherogenic as they come. And the really shocking thing to me about this is, you know, my mom was a nutritional scientist and was doing research in this area in the 1960s and 70s. I mentioned this stuff to her. We knew that. You know, we knew that 20, 30 years ago. So there's a little bit of a flavor of, you know, there's stuff that's been known, but also stuff that should have been known or that should have been looked at and that needs to be looked at. Now, what's interesting is that after the whole public outcry, litigation, and all those elements that occurred with the tobacco problem,
Right.
Industry's response to the question of trans fats, I think, has been very swift, relatively speaking. And we are now in the midst of a wave nationwide of a renunciation of trans fats. And I think that's a good thing. But, you know, there are other elements, as I point out, of you know, the high fructose corn syrup and the sweeteners and the elements. And quite often, I think, the amount necessary to make your product palatable is very different from the amount that's in there. Maybe I'll go further.
Right.
The amount necessary to make your product appealing is probably not as great as sometimes it's in there. I mean, you have to read labels.
Right.
Now, currently, I would say one of the biggest challenges on the educational front for all of us is knowing how to read labels and then getting into the habit of reading labels. Because the model of a market mechanism presumes an informed customer.
Right.
If the market is going to be efficient, it presumes an informed customer. But if the customer is not really well informed, and if the advertising is not designed to give you that kind of information, then in fact the market mechanism is not going to work very well.
Right.
So nutritional labeling and understanding and education is very important, and we have not done a good job, and I'll start with medical school. We have not done a good job at teaching nutrition and key elements of nutrition for our physicians, certainly not you know, at college level and in high schools and primary schools. There are now efforts, but in a sense, you know, the horse is out of the barn door. We have a lot of catching up to do.
Okay. So, what similarities if you take Codman Academy, what similarities and differences do you see in the school